Ben Hodges is a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant General. He was former commander of the U.S. Army Europe. Welcome to our program, General Hodges.
Thank you very much for the privilege.
I would like to begin our discussions with Russia and Vladimir Putin. Russian dictator Putin has faced numerous setbacks in the recent months: withdrawal from Syria, a failure to liberate the Kursk region, and unsustainable casualties for really incremental gains on the ground in Ukraine. In what condition and in what situation Russia enters the year of 2025?
I think that Russia today is in a much weaker position than it was 1 year ago. You've mentioned, of course, the collapse of the Assad regime and Russia's inability to save their ally Assad. Looking at the report yesterday of the last Russian submarine in the Mediterranean having to leave because they can no longer use their Navy base in Syria. I mean, these are powerful indicators of trouble. I can also vividly remember February last year when I was at the Munich Security Conference, and the news of the collapse of or the capture of Avdiivka was, everybody there in Munich was distraught almost. And since then, in 11 months, Russia has only been able to move forward about 60 kilometers. They still have not captured Pokrovsk, at the loss of hundreds of thousands of casualties and thousands of vehicles. And their inability to reduce the Ukrainian bridgehead inside the Kursk region, Oblast, and the fact that Ukraine launched a new attack in that same area this weekend, all of these point to serious problems on the Russian side.
As you just mentioned, Ukraine has launched another counteroffensive inside the Kursk region and already has made tactical advances, according to the U.S. Institute for Study for War. Do you see this as another Russia setback, as Ukrainian troops are on the offensive again, despite Vladimir Putin's orders to liberate and repel this attack of the Ukrainian armed forces?
Well, of course, it's very early days in this latest phase of the Kursk counteroffensive, and so the reporting is always going to be somewhat incomplete, and we're not entitled to know everything that's going on. But three things come to mind to me immediately. Number one, once again, Ukrainian armed forces have managed to launch a surprise attack in an area where you would think that Russia would be able to see and know everything that was going on because of the number of drones that they have, the fact that they have been fighting around the edges of the Kursk bridgehead for almost 7 months now, and that they were surprised by another attack. That tells me that Ukrainian competence on maintaining security and secrecy is very high level, and also Russia's ability to see what's going on in front of them is not what you would expect at this point in the war. The second takeaway for me is that this shows a real understanding of the operational level of warfare by the Ukrainian General Staff. By launching this attack, it continues to present dilemmas for the Russian General Staff. Do they have to pull resources now from another part of the war to address Kursk? Because obviously what they've done so far is not enough. And I've heard that Russian mill bloggers are complaining that Russia does not have adequate reserves in the region. This to me is astounding. The third takeaway, of course, is this complicates things for the Russian side if they are thinking about some sort of negotiated outcome where they get to keep what they have, because obviously Ukraine controls a significant part of the Kursk Oblast. So that's a real problem for the Kremlin as well. I am impressed with what Ukraine is accomplishing in the Kursk direction.
Also, 3,800 North Korean troops have already been killed or wounded, according to the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Do you see this deployment of the North Korean troops to Russia and Ukraine? Don't you think that this decision has turned out to become a big disaster for Vladimir Putin?
Well, it appears to me from talking to Ukrainian officers that the North Korean troops are employed by the Russians just as additional fodder, cannon fodder, that they are not bringing some special capabilities or a unique approach to anything. They are just fed into the fight. I think they're probably, of the 12,000 total North Korean troops, at least that's the unclassified reporting, they're divided into 4 brigades that are being integrated into Russian forces. So it's just more bodies being used in the same way that the Russians are. So I don't know that that has done a lot to help Russia, except maybe to give them an excuse not to draft soldiers from Moscow or the St. Petersburg area. On the North Korean side, I don't know. I wonder what was the payment to North Korea for these 12,000 soldiers? Was it money? Was it oil and gas? Was it some sort of technology? I don't imagine that Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, cares too much about losing thousands of his soldiers. I wonder what he's getting in return for this and if he will continue to do this.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is confident that US President-elect Donald Trump has enough leverage over Vladimir Putin to force Russia to stop the war and agree with a ceasefire proposal. Can you imagine a scenario in which Vladimir Putin agrees with Trump's proposal on a ceasefire?
I think first and foremost, of course, it depends on President Zelensky. That's the most important voice in any talk about starting negotiations or in the actual conduct of any negotiations. President Zelensky has to be the one. Ukraine will not do what the U.S. says or what Russia says, obviously. But to the point of your question, I think incoming U.S. President Trump has a lot more leverage over Putin now than he did 8 years ago. 8 years ago, Putin was in a very strong position politically, economically. He had the advantages, whereas Donald Trump was a brand new president, was not prepared for the office, and we were not in a good place. Now, 8 years later, Donald Trump shows up with a lot of experience. He inherits a very strong U.S. economy. He has the benefit of 31 allies in NATO, along with the U.S., most of whom recognize the importance of stopping Russia. So he won't have to convince them to do something. And I think President Trump, hopefully, I don't know this, but hopefully he will use that leverage to force Russia to leave or to accept some sort of an outcome that is favorable to Ukraine. I mean, he can continue to allow everything that the Biden administration was doing, plus. I mean, the system is already in place. All he has to do is say, give more, faster. Or he could use economic tools more effectively than the Biden administration did. Stop Russia from exporting oil and gas, for example, through the so-called shadow fleet out of the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea. Cut that off. And Russia is no longer able to sell oil and gas to China and India. That would, I think, have a significant impact. These are the kind of things that Trump could do.
But do you believe that it would be enough to stop Vladimir Putin?
I think Putin will keep going until he realizes he can't win. I think right now he still thinks that at some point the Trump administration will accept something less than the outcome that I think you and I both want and that Ukrainians want. Until he sees differently, I think he'll continue because casualties don't mean anything. Um, if the economy of Russia, however, continues to go south, then by the middle or towards the end of this year, I think Putin will start to feel real pressure from inside Russia that he has not had to worry about so far. So I think that's the only thing that will make Putin stop is when he realizes he cannot win.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the war could be stopped if Ukraine would be provided with bold security guarantees from the United States. What kind of security guarantees Trump's administration could provide Ukraine with, from your perspective?
Well, of course, the only true security guarantee is NATO membership. And unfortunately, the Trump administration has not indicated that they are in favor of this. There are many or several European countries that also are not yet in favor of it. But if the U.S. were to say, no, this is important, we will clear the way, we will help, we will do all these things, then I think most European countries could be persuaded. So NATO membership is the key. Now, the fact that the Mr. Trump has not shown any support for this so far, is not a good thing. But because I don't believe he is driven by ideological or moral things, but more about power and U.S. interests, I think he could change his mind quickly if he were to see that it's in the best interest of the United States that Ukraine becomes a member of NATO. That's why I still hold out some hope that this could happen. Now, short of NATO membership, of course, having U.S. troops and other European troops, Canadian troops inside of Ukraine with real capability, that would be helpful. But they would have to have a real mission. They would have to have all the necessary things like air and missile defense, counter drone capabilities. What would they be there for? I think this is the kind of thing that would help, but it would not have the same security guarantee that, say, obviously NATO membership would have.
And what is your assessment of the Kit Kellogg's plan on freezing the front lines and also deploying European peacekeeping forces without American U.S. boots on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, of course, General Kellogg's, a couple of things he said give me hope. Number one, he said publicly, Russia cannot be trusted. That's a very important starting point for any negotiation with Russia, is to acknowledge that they cannot be trusted. The second thing is he has emphasized the importance of Ukrainian sovereignty. That's important. But I think that if you start talking about any negotiation that allows Russia to keep what it has, especially Crimea, I think is a bad deal. As long as Russia controls Crimea, they will be able to block access into Azov Sea. They will be able to threaten the Odessa, Kherson, and the Mykolaiv ports, and they will always be ready to launch the next attack that will surely be coming in the next 2 or 3 or 4 years. So I have a problem with us putting pressure on Ukraine to give up territory for the sake of peace, when at the same time you acknowledge that Russia cannot be trusted. On the subject of a peacekeeping force, a good example of how to do it is the NATO IFOR, the implementation force that went into Bosnia in 1995. First of all, they had a real mandate. Second of all, they had a real agreement, the Dayton Peace Accord, to be implemented. And then NATO went in with a significant force that had air, land, and sea capabilities. They had all the things that were needed to be a credible deterrent force. It had a very clear chain of command, and it had rules of engagement that would allow soldiers to defend themselves, to use their weapons where appropriate. So any peacekeeping force has to have all these things. I mean, it has to have counter drone capability, has to have air and missile defense capability, and it has to be trained and ready to defend itself. Otherwise, it will not be a deterrent, because for sure the Russians on day one will begin to test it, just like they did after the ceasefires of the Minsk agreement, which were obviously a total failure.
David Tafuri is a former U.S. Department of State official and former UN official. Welcome to our program, Mr. Tafuri.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here in studio with you.
I would like to begin with your expectations for the year of 2025. There are lots of developments. Ukraine continues to fight back despite all the odds. Meanwhile, Vladimir Putin has suffered numerous setbacks in the recent months: withdrawal from Syria, also high casualties rate, failure to also liberate the Kursk region, and also the Russian economy is in a free fall right now. At the same time, Donald Trump has been elected as the next US president. What is your expectations regarding the war in Ukraine for this year of 2025?
Well, you're right. There are some good signs and setbacks for Putin and for Russia. The biggest thing that's going to happen this month in the United States is that President Trump will be inaugurated for a second term as president on January 20th. And he has talked about what he wants to do with respect to the war in Ukraine. And he said he wants it to end as soon as possible, and he wants to try to broker a deal. So I think we have to take him at his face that he is going to attempt to negotiate a resolution between Zelensky and Putin. But I also think it's going to be very difficult to get past the obstacles. And notably, Zelensky and Putin are very far apart in what they're willing to do, at least what they've said they're willing to do, to have a deal. So look for Trump to try to make that deal. If he doesn't get it quickly, then he's going to have to make some decisions about the U.S. approach to Ukraine. One of those questions is he going to continue the weapons and military aid to Ukraine? That's obviously crucial to the people here in Ukraine, and most importantly, crucial to the soldiers that are fighting on the front line on behalf of Ukraine, but really on behalf of the West against the aggression by Russia. President Trump will also have to decide very early on if he is going to continue the sanctions. And I would say that the sanctions, if we really want them to work, we have to not only keep the ones that we have in place, we have to add to them. Because while you said that Russia's economy is hurting, it's not hurting enough to slow down and stop the Russian war machine. Russia still has sufficient revenues, especially from its sale of oil, to manufacture more drones, more military equipment, and more weapons that are killing Ukrainians every day, as you know.
I would like also to pay your attention to the first question you just mentioned about security assistance. Would it be a real thing for Donald Trump to negotiate a ceasefire if he stops sending military aid for Ukraine?
Well, I think the premise of your question is a good one, which is that how can you negotiate a deal with Putin if you take the pressure off of him first? And hopefully President Trump and his senior advisors that are going to be coming into the White House with him recognize that actually to get a deal, they might have to ratchet up the support for Ukraine. They might have to ratchet up the sanctions, as I talked about in the last answer, do some more things on sanctions to really hurt Russia, to force Putin to the table.
From your perspective, what kind of leverage Donald Trump has over Russia in terms of Ukraine? And do you feel that he would be ready to use all tools which are on his table, which would be on his table in the White House?
I think he comes in with a lot of leverage to begin with, because I think Putin really wants some decisions from Trump that will be positive for Russia. He very much wants that sanctions relief. He also would like to see Trump ease off the weapons support to Ukraine. So he's going to try to appease President Trump. But if that leverage that Trump has doesn't work, President Trump is either going to have to increase the leverage or he's going to have to compromise. And hopefully he's not going to compromise in a way that hurts the long-term security, viability, and sovereignty of Ukraine.
How do you see the possible scenarios after the January 20th regarding Trump and these negotiations between the United States and Russia? And can you imagine a scenario in which Trump meets with Vladimir Putin in the United States, for example?
I can very much imagine a scenario where President Trump meets with Putin. Remember, he met with Putin, I think, 3 times, one-on-one, during his first presidency. And a couple of those meetings had a significant time where they were together just in private with 1 or 2 translators, no aides. And so that was how they formed this better relationship, supposedly, according to each of them. But whether President Trump is able to accomplish anything from those one-on-one meetings remains to be seen. Putin is a very cagey person. He's not always honest, even with people he considers friends, even when he can be easily shown to be not telling the truth. He also breaks deals all the time. So this is going to be a complicated, difficult negotiation between Trump and Putin. But I do think that they will meet in person. I'm not sure, though, that they will meet in person in the United States. I think Putin would be worried about going to the United States, as he is worried about going to any Western country around the world. Remember, he's indicted by the ICC. Now, the United States is not a member of the ICC convention, but the United States could choose to arrest him. I don't think that that would happen under President Trump, at least not initially. But I think there's too many dangers and too many questions around a visit by Putin to the United States. I don't think he would do it. Remember, he's not traveling very much. I think he's been to Belarus, he's been to China, he's been to a couple other places, but he's very worried about travel because he carries with him that baggage of being indicted by the ICC, accused as a war criminal, and believed to be a war criminal by people around the world, including especially in Europe.
Can Donald Trump be played by Vladimir Putin during one-on-one meetings, from your perspective?
Well, I would certainly hope not. And remember, President Trump, he may do some of those meetings one-on-one, but he has his advisors to prep him and prepare him and to bounce ideas off with, to report back on what he heard from Putin. I don't know what will happen in those discussions. I want to be optimistic. I want to take our incoming president at face value, that he does intend to find a compromise that's going to be good for both countries and be good for the world. But I do think anyone going into a negotiation with a former KGB officer, someone who's used to getting his way, someone who uses violence and uses corruption to get his way when he doesn't get it immediately, should be very wary of any discussions with Putin, should be question anything that he says, should look for backup for anything he says, and look for assurances that he's going to do what he says.
Also, there are lots of discussions regarding Kit Kellogg's plan on the war, on ending the war in Ukraine by creating a demilitarized zone across these front lines, by also imposing a ceasefire and enforcing this ceasefire with the European peacekeeping forces. What is your take on such plan, and do you believe that Kremlin can agree with such conditions?
I think this plan would be a good one if it could actually be implemented. I'm just not sure if it can be implemented for 2 reasons. First, I'm not sure where you would get these peacekeeping troops for. I don't see European countries, volunteering to send their young men and women into harm's way on the border with Russia, which again cannot be trusted, which is engaged in war crimes inside Ukraine and could easily engage in violence against peacekeeping troops. I also question whether Russia would actually observe any ceasefire, whether it would actually just break the ceasefire very early on after the ceasefire were entered into. And so these are some of the reasons why I'm not sure this plan will work, but in theory, it's a good one.
Is there a potential for a confrontation between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in case if Putin declines, like the best case offer, Trump's offer on Ukraine?
He hasn't said much, President Trump, to suggest that he wants to, engage in any sort of confrontation militarily between the United States and Russia, but he is also unpredictable. And so if he ends up being very disappointed by Putin, if he feels like Putin has lied to him or has harmed him or harmed his presidency, you could imagine that's possible. But we haven't heard any communications from President Trump or his advisors to suggest that they are leaning that way.
Let's cover also North Korean involvement in the war in Ukraine. According to President Zelensky, 3,800 North Koreans have already been killed or wounded in the war against Ukraine. Why did Biden's administration fail to deter deployment of North Korean troops to Ukraine and Russia?
Well, this is an astounding development. It happened very quickly. We heard that, 10,000 or more North Korean troops had showed up in Russia, that they were being sent to the front line in the Kursk region, and now many have been killed and slaughtered. And there are reports that suggest that Russia hasn't been careful about protecting the lives of these North Korean soldiers. And I'd also note that these North Korean soldiers are not battle tested. Many of them are probably not well trained. We don't know about the interoperability between North Korean troops and Russian troops. I think there are big questions there about whether they are even working together well. They've basically been slaughtered. And Kim Jong-un, the leader of North Korea, probably doesn't care, because he doesn't care much about the welfare of his people. His country is destitute. It's impoverished. There's a political oppression in North Korea. So perhaps there aren't many repercussions for a dictator like Kim Jong-un when he sends his people to be killed for no reason, for no valid reason in Russia. But I think it's a concern because it shows that some countries, rogue states like North Korea, are willing to support Russia no matter what, that they want that alliance so badly. They're willing to sacrifice the lives of so many young people from their country. Hopefully that's not going to happen with more of the other countries that are friendly with Russia. But I would note, Russia doesn't have that many friends in the world. You're talking about North Korea, Belarus, Iran, used to be Syria. That's not their friend anymore. They're being kicked out of Syria. Just a few countries that actually support Russia no matter what. Let's hope that alliance does not grow. And that's one of the things that the incoming president and NATO have an obligation to prevent, is to prevent there from being stronger alliances for Russia so it can rely on more countries as it continues this illegal war here in Ukraine.
Let's also sum up President Biden's legacy on Ukraine. What, from your perspective, what are the biggest successes and failures of the President Biden's decisions on Ukraine?
Well, I think people will remember that President Biden and the Biden administration were very clear from the beginning of the invasion, even before the invasion, that if Russia invaded Ukraine, it would be illegal and the United States would oppose it, and the United States with NATO would defend Ukraine. And so I think he deserves accolades for his very certain stance on that position and for following up. As soon as the invasion happened in February of 2022, the United States began providing support. It actually began providing support, of course, before that, giving training, giving weapons. And so I think Biden and the Biden administration deserve credit for the very firm stance they took against Russia and for the substantial support that they've given. And remember, no other country has given as much as the United States has to Ukraine in this time of crisis. But I'll also say that given where we are now, almost 3 years after the invasion, and the fact that Ukraine is still bogged down in a violent war that is destroying the country and killing so many innocent people here in Ukraine, that people may question why the Biden administration did not do more, especially 6 months into the war, a year into the war, a year and a half into the war, when it was clear that for Ukraine to win, it needed more weapons. It needed restrictions on its use of weapons to be lifted. It needed the delivery of weapons to happen faster. It needed sophisticated weapons systems like the Patriot missiles that they have now but didn't have at the beginning. And they need more of them. We don't have enough Patriot missile systems here. We need more of all of this weapons and equipment, and people will probably question why Biden didn't provide it more quickly and a greater quantity of it, so that when Russia was particularly weak in the first few months after the invasion, Ukraine wasn't able to make more gains.